I never imagined that selling a piece of land could bring such disaster into my life. The land itself had been in my family for decades, a small plot in Georgia that held not just financial value, but the memories of generations. It was a place I had grown up visiting during summers, where I had learned the importance of care, responsibility, and foresight. Every corner of that property had meaning, from the old oak at the edge to the tiny creek that ran alongside it. Selling it was not a casual decision. It was a sacrifice that weighed heavily on my heart. My husband and I had been together for several years, and over that time I had come to know his family in ways that were sometimes complicated, often challenging, but occasionally rewarding. His stepson, a bright and gentle boy, had become someone I cared for deeply. He was not my child by blood, yet his life mattered to me as much as any child I could ever have. When his condition was diagnosed, it felt like the weight of responsibility landed squarely on my shoulders. The doctors made it clear that the surgery was urgent, that without immediate intervention, there could be irreversible consequences. Time was a luxury we did not have, and financial resources were not immediately sufficient. I calculated every possible source of funding. Savings were limited. Loans would take weeks to process, and the bureaucracy of insurance claims was slow and cumbersome. The land, appraised at $30,000, was the only resource that could guarantee the money would be available immediately. It was painful to think about, almost physically so, yet I knew that this was a moment to act, to make a choice that was morally undeniable. Life, after all, outweighed legacy. Preparing to sell the land required careful planning. I gathered deeds, verified taxes, and contacted appraisers. The paperwork was meticulous and exhaustive. Every signature had to be verified, every document correctly filed, and every step had to comply with legal standards. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. I spent long nights reviewing forms, making sure no detail was overlooked, because I understood that any delay could cost a life. Throughout the process, I observed my husband's reactions. At first, he was quiet, thoughtful, and somewhat distracted. I interpreted this as concern for his son's well-being, a mixture of gratitude and worry. Later, I noticed subtle tension in his tone, a rigidity in his posture when we discussed the land. He seemed to wrestle with emotions that he did not express openly, and I could feel the undercurrent of frustration beneath his polite words. I dismissed it at first, thinking it was the stress of the situation, but deep down, a small voice in my mind warned that something was not right. The day the land was officially sold and the funds were transferred to cover the surgery, I felt a surge of relief. I had acted decisively, ethically, and with love. The stepson's surgery could proceed, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe. That relief, however, was fleeting. The unexpected cruelty that followed would shatter my sense of security and the illusion of a supportive marriage. Immediately after the surgery was confirmed and the boy was stable, my husband's demeanor shifted dramatically. A sudden rage overtook him, directed not at circumstances, but at me. The slap was swift, shocking, and completely unprovoked by any action other than the fact that I had executed a decision he had not agreed with. The physical sting was severe, yet the emotional impact was far greater. In that moment, I realized that the marriage was not a partnership based on shared values or mutual respect. Instead, it was defined by control, anger, and selfishness masked as concern. After the assault, I experienced a whirlwind of emotions. Shock and fear collided with sadness and anger. I sat in the quiet of our home, my thoughts racing. I understood that this was a defining moment. My safety, my autonomy, and my ability to make moral choices for the people I cared about were now non-negotiable. I began to plan carefully, documenting everything, taking photographs of the injury and making mental notes of what had occurred. I was aware that evidence would be essential if I wanted to protect myself legally and ensure accountability. At the same time, I reflected on the steps that had led to this point. The sale of the land had been a sacrifice of personal and familial significance. It represented years of memories and future security. Choosing to sell it required moral courage and clarity of purpose. It also revealed in stark contrast the true nature of the person I had married. His anger over the land was irrational, yet it carried consequences that forced me to confront the reality of my circumstances. The stepson's recovery progressed well, and knowing that he would live and thrive gave me a renewed sense of purpose. My actions had directly contributed to saving a young life. That knowledge offered some comfort, even as I grappled with the betrayal and violence I had just endured. Balancing relief with the need for safety became an urgent task. I arranged secure accommodations, ensured access to my personal finances, and began exploring legal avenues for protection. As I reflected further, patterns emerged in my husband's behavior that had been invisible before. Financial decisions, secretive phone calls, and unexplained absences suddenly gained new significance. The land money, while ostensibly used for the stepson's surgery, was entangled in a network of private motives I had not understood. Understanding the deeper reason behind his rage became essential, not only for my protection, but also to prevent further betrayal and manipulation. Every day following the incident, I took deliberate steps to reinforce my safety and autonomy. I documented each encounter, noting tone, words, and behavior. I considered the potential involvement of local authorities, legal counsel, and support networks. Each decision was a measured response to ensure that I could act decisively if the situation escalated further. The juxtaposition of moral action and personal danger became increasingly clear. Saving a life had led to personal harm, and an act of selflessness had been met with violence. Yet within this paradox, I discovered clarity. I could not control my husband's reactions, but I could control my choices, my actions, and the steps I took to protect myself and the boy I had helped. The decision to sell the land was not made lightly. Every night, I replayed the memories attached to it. The summer evenings when my parents would take me there, the picnics under the shade of the old oak tree, and the way the sun glimmered on the small creek that ran along the edge. It had been my inheritance, my security, and my dream for the future. Selling it meant letting go of a part of myself, a piece of my history, and the comfort that came from knowing I had a backup for emergencies. Yet the stepson's health left no room for hesitation. The doctors had warned that the surgery could not be delayed, and every day we waited increased the risk of permanent damage. My husband, though initially grateful, seemed increasingly stressed by the cost. I could see the tension in his eyes when he looked at the land documents or when we discussed financial plans. I tried to assure myself that his anxiety was natural, but a quiet worry began to grow that his feelings might not be as straightforward as they seemed. I spent hours reviewing every option for the sale. I contacted real estate agents and appraisers, gathering the most accurate value for the land. Each interaction reminded me of the stakes involved. This was more than money. This was life-saving intervention for a boy who had come to depend on me in ways his own parents might not fully understand. The process was grueling, filled with phone calls, emails, and a flurry of paperwork that seemed to multiply with every signature required. During this time, I also watched my husband closely. There were moments when he seemed distant, almost secretive, and it left me unsettled. He made phone calls in another room, sometimes speaking in a tone I could not hear clearly, other times closing his laptop and moving away abruptly. I assumed it was stress or concern for his son, but there was a growing sense that something else lurked beneath the surface. I kept these observations to myself, focusing instead on ensuring the surgery could proceed without delay. The day the land finally sold was both a relief and a heartbreak. Watching the funds transfer into the account that would pay for the stepson's surgery brought a sense of moral victory. I had acted decisively, selflessly, and with love. The boy would survive, and I could breathe for the first time in weeks. The relief was almost overwhelming, washing over me with a sense of accomplishment and duty fulfilled. That evening, however, my sense of security was shattered. My husband, who had been quiet throughout the day, turned suddenly hostile. The slap came without warning, sharp and forceful, a violation that made my head spin and my heart race. It was not just a physical blow. It was a brutal confirmation that my sacrifices, my morality, and my love for his family were meaningless in the face of his rage. In that moment, the marriage I had believed to be built on shared values revealed itself as a fragile structure held together by control and fear. I sat in shock, the sting of the slap still burning. Confusion and disbelief battled with anger and sorrow. I realized that the decision to save his son's life, a decision I had made out of love and compassion, had triggered an explosion of violence. The juxtaposition was incomprehensible. I had risked everything to do what was right, and yet I had been punished for it. In the days that followed, I focused on recovery and reflection. I documented every detail of the incident, knowing that evidence would be crucial should I need to take legal action. I photographed bruises, saved messages, and made detailed notes about the circumstances of the attack. The necessity of acting decisively became clear. I could not rely on the marriage to provide safety or support. My autonomy and security were now non-negotiable priorities. At the same time, I monitored the stepson's recovery closely. Seeing him regain strength and begin to smile again provided a measure of comfort, a reminder that my actions had saved a life. Yet the knowledge of my husband's betrayal and the violent outburst overshadowed any sense of victory. I felt trapped between relief and fear. Knowing that my decision had saved the boy, but had also placed me in immediate danger, I began to analyze my husband's behavior more critically. His anger over the land, a financial asset that had been in my family for years, revealed an obsessive need for control. His secrecy and sudden outbursts hinted at motives I did not yet fully understand. Each day I pieced together patterns of his actions, realizing that the slap was not an isolated incident, but part of a deeper dynamic of manipulation and selfishness. As I considered my options, I took deliberate steps to ensure my safety. I arranged access to personal funds, secured important documents, and contacted trusted friends who could provide temporary refuge if necessary. The realization that I had to act with both caution and decisiveness was sobering. I could no longer assume that the home or the relationship offered protection. My survival and the integrity of my moral choices depended on careful planning and swift action. The emotional weight of the situation was immense. Selling the land had been a deeply personal sacrifice, one that I had believed to be the right moral choice. The stepson's life was worth every ounce of heartache involved in that decision. Yet the slap revealed the fragility of trust and the potential for betrayal even from those closest to us. The juxtaposition of my selfless act with the violence I endured created a complex emotional landscape, one that required careful navigation to ensure both my safety and continued support for the boy I had helped. Through reflection, I also recognized the importance of understanding the deeper motives behind my husband's rage. The $30,000 was not just a financial asset, it represented his own plans, desires, and perhaps undisclosed debts or obligations. Understanding why he reacted with such violence was crucial to preventing further harm and making informed decisions about the future of our marriage. The more I observed and documented, the clearer it became that his priorities were not aligned with the welfare of his family, but with control over assets and circumstances. This realization strengthened my resolve. I could not allow fear, shock, or anger to dictate my actions. I needed to act strategically, documenting evidence, ensuring the stepson's safety, and preparing for the eventual confrontation with my husband's abuse. Each action, each careful step, reinforced my autonomy and protected my capacity to make moral and ethical decisions for those who depended on me. As the days passed, I consolidated my support network, ensuring that trusted friends and professionals were aware of the situation. I sought guidance on legal protections, domestic abuse protocols, and strategies for preserving my safety while maintaining care for the stepson. The dual focus on moral responsibility and personal security became the central theme of my daily life, guiding every decision and action I took. The $30,000 land was more than just money. It was a piece of my childhood, a tangible connection to the family I had lost over the years. My parents had saved it for me carefully, passing it down through generations as a symbol of stability and hope for the future. I remembered visiting the plot as a child, running through tall grass with the wind whipping against my face, the smell of fresh earth filling my senses. There were countless stories tied to that land, family picnics, birthdays celebrated under the wide oak tree, and late summer evenings when the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold. To sell it felt like tearing a piece of my heart away, yet the life of a boy who had come to depend on me hung in the balance. The stepson's condition had been worsening over the months, and the doctors had finally insisted that surgery was non-negotiable. His father's reluctance to discuss financial options in detail left me in a difficult position. I felt the weight of responsibility settle heavily on my shoulders. The boy was not biologically mine, but I had grown to love him as if he were. Watching him struggle, pale and fragile, tugged at every part of me, and I knew that action had to be immediate. Delays could mean complications, even permanent damage, and I could not accept that outcome. I spent hours considering alternatives, analyzing every financial path that might save the boy's life without sacrificing the land. Loans were complicated, interest rates were high, and family offers were slow and uncertain. Each potential solution crumbled under scrutiny until only one option remained: selling the land immediately. The thought made my stomach churn. This property had been my security, my safety net for the future, and my personal inheritance. Yet the boy's life outweighed any attachment I had to material possessions. Every dollar mattered, and every moment of delay could cost him dearly. My husband and I reviewed the steps necessary to liquidate the property. The paperwork alone was a maze, requiring titles, deeds, notarizations, and bank authorizations. Each page reminded me of the weight of the sacrifice. My hands shook slightly as I signed documents that had belonged to my family for generations. It was not just money changing hands. It was a tangible piece of my life, my history, and my identity. I felt a strange mix of resolve and grief. I was doing the right thing, yet a part of me mourned the loss I knew would never be replaced. During this time, I also observed my husband closely. He seemed calm at first, expressing gratitude for the action I was taking. Yet subtle signs began to emerge. He made phone calls in another room, often lowering his voice and closing his laptop abruptly. He spent long hours away under the guise of work, and I noticed small changes in his behavior. furtive glances, tight lips, and an increasing rigidity in his tone. I wondered if he was stressed or anxious, but the growing unease suggested something else, something hidden beneath the surface. Despite these concerns, I remained focused on the surgery. The day of the sale was surreal. Watching the funds transfer into the account earmarked for the surgery brought a sense of relief I could hardly describe. I felt moral satisfaction knowing that I had acted decisively to save a young life. The stepson's medical team confirmed the schedule, and within hours he was admitted for surgery. As I watched him being wheeled away, I felt a mix of fear, hope, and exhaustion. The relief of knowing that the procedure was happening was almost overwhelming. I allowed myself a moment of private gratitude, taking comfort in the fact that my choice had created this opportunity for survival. That evening, however, the fragile peace shattered. My husband's demeanor shifted abruptly. His tone was harsh, his gaze hard, and the words that were unspoken carried a weight that struck me to the core. The slap came suddenly, leaving a burning sting across my face and a deeper ache in my heart. The physical shock was overwhelming, but the emotional impact was far greater. The marriage I had believed to be built on shared love and mutual respect revealed itself as one dependent on control and the assertion of power. In an instant, everything I thought I understood about our relationship crumbled. I was stunned, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. The act of violence came immediately after the stepson's safety had been secured, highlighting the senselessness of the betrayal. I realized that no amount of sacrifice or moral action could shield me from the destructive impulses my husband harbored. The juxtaposition of saving a life and being punished for it left me reeling, a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and simmering anger. In the days that followed, I focused on recovery and assessment. Every detail of the incident was documented carefully. Photographs, notes, and accounts of the circumstances were preserved meticulously, creating a record that could be relied upon if legal action became necessary. I knew that leaving the marriage would require evidence, clarity, and preparation. The path forward would be difficult, but it was essential for my safety and integrity. The stepson's recovery became both a solace and a reminder of the stakes involved. Observing his gradual return to strength and vitality provided a small measure of comfort, reinforcing the value of my decision. Yet even as I took satisfaction in his progress, the shadow of the slap loomed large. The knowledge that my selfless act had resulted in violence underscored the perilous nature of my situation. The decision to act morally had exacted a personal cost I could not ignore. I turned my attention to understanding my husband's motives more deeply. His anger over the sale of the land suggested that his priorities were not aligned with the welfare of his family, but rather with personal control or undisclosed plans. Each observation of his behavior, every secretive phone call, and every terse exchange contributed to a growing picture of someone whose intentions were hidden and potentially harmful. This insight became a crucial element in determining the steps I would take next. While processing these events, I also ensured that my immediate environment was safe. Access to personal finances, secure storage of important documents, and communication with trusted friends were all prioritized. I recognized that acting decisively and strategically was the only way to protect myself and maintain the ability to support the stepson's ongoing needs. Safety planning became a central focus, intertwined with the moral imperative of preserving life and integrity. The emotional landscape was complex. I experienced relief at the stepson's recovery, grief over the loss of the land, and fear from the violent betrayal. Each emotion carried its own weight, creating a tapestry of conflicting feelings that demanded careful navigation. I learned to compartmentalize, focusing on practical steps while allowing myself controlled reflection on the moral dimensions of my choices. The clarity of purpose that emerged from this struggle reinforced my resolve to act in ways that were both protective and ethical. As I contemplated the future, I realized the importance of uncovering the full truth behind my husband's actions. The slap was not an isolated incident, but an expression of deeper patterns and motivations. Understanding these factors was essential for ensuring long-term safety and preventing further manipulation or harm. Observation, documentation, and reflection became daily practices, sharpening my awareness and guiding my decisions. Every action I took reinforced a sense of autonomy. Maintaining control over finances, monitoring interactions, and preparing contingency plans strengthened my position. I became increasingly aware that my moral courage in selling the land was not sufficient protection against someone willing to resort to violence. Strategic action, documentation, and preparation were necessary complements to ethical behavior. In tandem with these steps, I nurtured the bond with the stepson. Ensuring that he felt safe, valued, and cared for became a priority. His trust and well-being were reminders that the sacrifices I had made were not in vain. Every small smile, every sign of recovery reinforced the moral correctness of my actions and provided emotional sustenance amidst the chaos of betrayal. Through this period, I developed a clear understanding of the stakes. The land represented security and inheritance, the stepson represented life and hope, and the husband represented unpredictability and danger. Balancing these factors required careful, deliberate action. Each day demanded attention to detail, foresight, and emotional resilience. The process was grueling but necessary. As the dust settled from the whirlwind of the sale and the surgery, a fragile sense of relief took hold. The stepson's condition stabilized, and for a brief moment it felt as though my decision had secured not just his life, but a sense of moral victory. Yet beneath that surface, unease began to simmer. My husband's anger had not dissipated. The slap, sudden and brutal, lingered in my mind like a dark echo, a warning that the consequences of my actions were far from over. I realized that saving a life had not shielded me from betrayal. The following days were a delicate balance between hope and vigilance. I monitored the stepson's recovery closely, managing medications, attending follow-up appointments, and providing emotional support. Each sign of progress was a small victory, but it also reminded me of the cost, the land, the sense of security, and the trust I had placed in the man I married. I could see the subtle ways my husband's behavior was changing. He avoided conversations about the land, stared at me with a tightness in his jaw that hinted at unresolved fury, and grew increasingly withdrawn during family moments. The emotional distance he created was suffocating, and I knew that ignoring it would be dangerous. I began documenting every incident, every sign of tension, and every unusual interaction. I cataloged his movements, kept records of finances, and noted the progression of the stepson's recovery. Each entry built a clearer picture of the man I thought I knew versus the man who now revealed himself in anger and control. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, ensuring that I could protect both myself and the child. This vigilance was exhausting, but it was necessary. Even as I carried out these practical measures, I could feel the emotional undercurrent intensifying. My husband's resentment was palpable. He would make pointed remarks about the land's value, hinting that its sale was reckless and irresponsible, despite knowing that the funds had saved a life. The contrast between the life-affirming choice I had made and the anger it triggered in him created a surreal tension, like living in two parallel realities, one grounded in moral action, the other in fear and betrayal. I started to notice patterns in his behavior that I had previously overlooked. He made sudden trips under vague pretenses, took calls in private with an intensity that suggested secrecy, and displayed subtle signs of irritation when I managed household or financial matters. The more I observed, the clearer it became that his rage over the land was not solely about money. Something deeper, more personal, was driving his aggression, and it would take careful attention to uncover the truth. At the same time, the stepson's recovery offered moments of light. Watching him regain strength, laughing in small bursts, and interacting normally again provided reassurance that my sacrifice had meaning. These moments were bittersweet. They reminded me of why I had acted, but they also made the growing tension at home all the more unbearable. I realized that moral courage alone would not protect me from the consequences of being married to someone whose control and anger were unchecked. I began to prepare for the possibility that further conflict was inevitable. I ensured that my finances were secure, that key documents were stored safely, and that I had a plan for where I could go if the situation escalated. Each precaution was a step toward autonomy and protection. I also considered the legal avenues available to me, understanding that documenting events and having evidence would be crucial if the situation worsened. As the days passed, the atmosphere at home grew heavier. My husband's anger remained, even though he masked it with superficial calm during family interactions. The slap had been a turning point, a concrete demonstration that his rage could manifest physically. I knew I could not ignore this behavior, and I understood that decisive action would be required to safeguard myself and the child. This growing tension marked the transition into a new phase of reality, where moral decisions intersected with personal safety, and where the true challenge would not just be preserving life, but also protecting my own well-being. The stage was set for the unfolding conflict, a dance of vigilance, investigation, and emotional endurance that would demand every ounce of clarity, courage, and strategic thinking I possessed. The time had come to move beyond reflection and preparation and into action. I began to uncover the deeper motives behind my husband's rage, examining his behavior, finances, and personal connections. Every discovery added layers to the story, revealing a man whose priorities were not aligned with the welfare of those around him. It became clear that my next steps would define not only the future of my relationship, but also my safety and moral integrity. This was the point where Act 2 began, the dance of conflict and betrayal. Each day brought new revelations. Each observation sharpened my understanding, and every decision carried immense weight. The groundwork had been laid by the sacrifice I had made, but the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Vigilance, strategy, and resolve became my guiding principles as I navigated the dangerous and complex landscape of home, family, and personal betrayal. The tension in the house escalated slowly but unmistakably. Each morning brought a renewed sense of caution, a silent calculation about what would trigger his anger next. I moved carefully, aware of every word, every action, and every glance. The slap was no longer an isolated incident. It was the first sign of a pattern. I could feel the undercurrent of hostility whenever the land was mentioned, or even when the stepson's name came up in conversation. There was an invisible line I could never cross without consequences. I began reviewing the process of the land sale in my mind, step by step. Every signature, every bank transfer, and every document felt monumental. The $30,000 had been liquidated not for frivolous reasons, not for luxury, but to save a young boy's life. And yet the very act of doing good had sparked violence. I questioned myself at times, wondering if I had misjudged his character, but deep down I knew my intentions were pure. I reminded myself that the stepson's recovery was tangible proof that my choice mattered, and no one could diminish that fact. As the week went on, I started noticing small discrepancies in my husband's behavior. He would hide receipts, make calls late at night, and shut his office door with a deliberate finality. There were whispered conversations when I was in the other room, sudden silences when I entered, and fleeting expressions of anger he could not hide. It became clear that his rage over the land was only part of a deeper secret, something connected to finances, relationships, or both. I began carefully tracking these signs, keeping mental notes and private records of every unusual incident. The stepson continued to recover, yet even this brought mixed emotions. Seeing him regain strength brought immense relief and happiness, but it also highlighted the stark contrast between the gratitude he displayed and the hostility from his father. While the boy smiled and laughed, my husband's gaze remained sharp and calculating, a constant reminder that danger lurked even in moments of joy. I could no longer separate my concern for the child from the necessity of protecting myself. Each recovery milestone became a reminder that my sacrifice was not universally appreciated, and that the person I married could not be trusted with kindness. I sought to understand the source of his anger more deeply. In quiet moments, I examined the family finances, the timing of his calls, and patterns in his spending. I discovered that there were debts and obligations he had concealed. There were late payments and loans that he had not mentioned, some of which directly involved the land I sold. My intuition told me that the money I had secured for the surgery might have been intended for other purposes that benefited him personally, not the stepson. This revelation made the slap and his subsequent behavior even more chilling. His anger was not simply emotional, it was rooted in greed, control, and secrecy. I realized that the home I had thought was a safe haven had become a minefield. The lines between family loyalty and personal safety had blurred. I began planning contingencies, identifying safe places to stay, keeping copies of important documents, and establishing a small emergency fund that could not be accessed by him. Each step required caution. He was unpredictable, and any hint of my preparations could provoke another violent reaction. The emotional strain was relentless. I felt a constant gnawing anxiety, and even minor interactions with my husband required careful calculation. I learned to speak in neutral tones, to avoid unnecessary movements, and to respond with calm precision. Every decision was weighed against potential outcomes, balancing my role as a caretaker to the stepson with the urgent need for self-preservation. The house, once a symbol of family unity, had transformed into a landscape of tension, vigilance, and hidden strategy. One evening, while reviewing bills and receipts, I discovered further irregularities. Certain transactions did not match the explanations my husband had provided. Large sums appeared to have been diverted for unknown purposes, and there were signs of attempts to manipulate accounts in ways that would obscure the flow of money. This was the confirmation I needed. His rage over the $30,000 was not about the surgery, but about the control of assets and the concealment of his own schemes. The slap had been both punishment and warning, a demonstration of power intended to silence me. With this knowledge, I began systematically collecting evidence. I made discrete copies of documents, tracked patterns of behavior, and created a detailed timeline of financial activity. Every new discovery reinforced my resolve. I understood that leaving the situation safely required preparation and that confrontation without support could be dangerous. My focus shifted from emotional recovery to tactical planning, balancing the desire to protect the stepson with the urgent need to protect myself. Meanwhile, the stepson's recovery progressed, and he began to resume normal activities. He showed appreciation in small ways, hugging me, expressing excitement at minor victories, and relying on me for support. Each interaction was a reminder that my sacrifice had purpose and that my vigilance was worthwhile. It also intensified my awareness that the environment I was in was toxic and that shielding him from harm required careful management of the household dynamics. I continued observing my husband, noting patterns and inconsistencies. His anger over the land did not subside. It grew more refined, subtle, and unpredictable. He would make veiled comments, express irritation over mundane matters, and attempt to undermine my authority in household decisions. Each interaction reinforced the reality that the slap had not been an isolated incident, but the start of a sustained campaign of intimidation. At the same time, I reinforced my own support network. Friends and family who were aware of the situation provided encouragement, discreet guidance, and practical advice. I avoided drawing attention to my husband's behavior publicly, understanding that his reaction to exposure could escalate. This careful balance of discretion and preparation became the backbone of my strategy to navigate the escalating conflict. The combination of vigilance, investigation, and careful planning marked the dance of conflict. Each day required monitoring, assessment, and calculated responses. I tracked his movements, confirmed his accounts, and documented his behavior, all while ensuring the stepson's needs were met. The household became a delicate equilibrium, with every action weighed against potential consequences. Through this period, I developed a deeper understanding of my husband's character. His priorities were not aligned with the welfare of the child or the integrity of family life. His focus was control, secrecy, and personal gain. Recognizing this allowed me to detach emotionally from his provocations while intensifying my commitment to self-preservation and justice. The $30,000 land had been sold for a life, yet it had also illuminated the full extent of his betrayal. As the days turned into weeks, I began formulating a plan for decisive action. I understood that leaving the house safely, protecting the stepson, and securing legal recourse required careful timing and thorough preparation. The evidence I gathered would serve not only as protection, but also as leverage in pursuing justice. Each document, each record, and each note became part of a comprehensive strategy to ensure that my sacrifice was respected and that violence would not go unchallenged. The emotional and practical groundwork laid in this period defined the trajectory of Act Two. The interplay between observation, discovery, and preparation created a rhythm, a dance of vigilance and strategic decision-making. Each revelation about finances, behavior, and hidden motives fueled a growing awareness that the path forward required courage, clarity, and action. The moment of ultimate confrontation had not yet arrived, but every step taken during this dance ensured that when it did, I would be ready. Awareness became power, preparation became protection, and moral clarity became a guiding principle. The home that had once symbolized family and stability had transformed into a stage for uncovering truth, asserting autonomy, and ultimately reclaiming control over my life. The stage was set for the next critical phase, revealing the hidden motives, confronting the betrayal, and taking the steps necessary to sever ties safely and permanently. This careful accumulation of knowledge, evidence, and strategy was not just about responding to violence. It was about reclaiming dignity, safeguarding the child, and ensuring that the decision to sacrifice for a life was honored rather than punished. The dance of conflict and betrayal continued, each day revealing new facets of deception, control, and hidden agendas. My vigilance sharpened, my resolve strengthened, and my understanding of the stakes deepened. Every discovery reinforced the necessity of decisive action, the moment to confront the truth, to act on the evidence collected and to protect both the stepson and myself approached with relentless inevitability. The days after I filed the restraining order became a blur of planning, observation, and cautious maneuvering. The house felt smaller, almost suffocating, as every corner reminded me of the betrayal that had occurred. I moved carefully through each room, cataloging details, documenting changes, and taking note of every interaction. Each glance from my husband carried a subtle threat, a reminder that his anger had not subsided. Every conversation, every movement was now a test of patience, observation, and strategic thinking. I began reviewing the steps of the land sale and the transfer of funds in meticulous detail. Every signature, every bank transaction, every notarized document became a piece of the puzzle. I compared dates, times, and amounts, reconstructing the process to ensure there were no errors or missteps on my part. The clarity I gained from this exercise helped reduce the fear that had been gnawing at me since the slap. I realized that my actions were legally and morally justified. Selling the $30,000 land to save the stepson's life was not only correct, it was the only choice a responsible and caring person could make. At the same time, I continued to monitor my husband's behavior. His movements grew more calculated, and his efforts to assert dominance became subtler but more pervasive. I noticed him reviewing accounts at odd hours, making phone calls he hid from me, and becoming defensive over even minor household decisions. There were late-night visits to the office, unexplained documents slipped into drawers, and financial statements that didn't match the reality I could see. I began suspecting that the $30,000 I had sacrificed might not have been solely the source of his anger. Something larger, deeper, and more insidious was lurking behind his actions. The stepson's recovery added a complicated layer to my vigilance. As he regained strength, he became more aware of the tension in the house. I had to balance nurturing his recovery with shielding him from the escalating conflict. He asked questions that I answered carefully, aware that every word could become a trigger for my husband. Each day I had to reinforce a calm, protective environment while keeping meticulous records of both his well-being and my husband's unpredictable behavior. During one quiet evening, I discovered discrepancies in the family accounts that alarmed me. Certain transfers did not align with the explanations my husband had provided. Large sums were being moved between accounts without clear purpose, some appearing to benefit other parties I did not initially understand. The realization struck me hard. The $30,000 land money might have been intended for purposes that had nothing to do with the stepson's surgery. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he planned to use the money for a mistress, to pay off hidden debts, or for something even more secretive? The slap had been a warning, a punishment not for the act of care, but for interfering with his concealed plans. I began constructing a detailed timeline of every financial decision he had made in the past year. Each entry revealed more inconsistencies and patterns of secrecy. Receipts, bank statements, and digital communications painted a picture of a man who prioritized control and personal gain above family welfare. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the slap was symptomatic of a larger pattern of manipulation and deceit. My sacrifice for the stepson had unknowingly intersected with a hidden agenda, one that my husband had fiercely protected. This revelation changed my strategy entirely. Protecting myself was no longer sufficient. I needed to expose the hidden motives behind his rage. I methodically compiled evidence of financial mismanagement, secret transfers, and misleading communications. Each piece of evidence strengthened my position and clarified the necessity of my next actions. The emotional weight of betrayal deepened, but it was now coupled with a sense of purpose and urgency. In addition to documenting finances, I scrutinized his behavior in daily interactions. His subtle attempts to provoke, intimidate, or guilt me became more apparent. Every tone of voice, glance, and movement was analyzed for meaning. I noted instances where he attempted to frame the narrative, manipulate perception, and maintain control over both me and the household. The dance of observation became a critical tool, ensuring that every step I took was measured and informed. During this period, I also began exploring safe exit strategies. I researched temporary housing, lined up supportive friends and family, and coordinated with legal advisors to understand the full spectrum of protective measures available. Each plan was designed to allow me to leave the house, if necessary, without jeopardizing the stepson's well-being or my own safety. Preparing for the worst-case scenario was emotionally taxing, but it also provided a sense of empowerment. Knowledge and preparation became my shield against the unpredictable violence I had already experienced. The stepson remained central to every decision. I could not risk exposing him to further stress or conflict. While the surgery had succeeded, the environment of fear and tension was an ongoing threat. I focused on creating spaces of stability for him, moments where he could feel secure and loved, even as the larger household dynamics remained volatile. This dual responsibility, protecting him while securing my own safety, required constant vigilance and emotional fortitude. One day, while reviewing digital records, I discovered evidence that the $30,000 land money had indeed been earmarked for purposes other than the surgery. There were transactions leading to accounts I had never been told about, payments that suggested the existence of hidden relationships or financial obligations. The realization was devastating. My husband's rage had not been about carelessness or oversight. It had been a calculated response to interference in his personal schemes. The slap was not merely physical violence. It was a manifestation of deeper deception, a warning, and a punishment rolled into one. This understanding clarified my next moves. I began assembling all evidence into a coherent dossier. Financial documents, bank statements, digital messages, and a detailed timeline of events were organized meticulously. Each page reinforced the narrative of deceit and manipulation. I realized that exposing this truth was not just necessary for my own justice, but for protecting the stepson from future harm and ensuring that no further acts of control could be executed against me. As the weeks progressed, my confidence grew. I had transformed fear into strategy, betrayal into evidence, and confusion into clarity. Each day of observation and documentation strengthened my position. I refined my plans, coordinated with legal advisors, and prepared for confrontation. The house that once felt like a trap became a controlled environment where I could observe, record, and plan every step carefully. The tension with my husband remained, but it had evolved. He became more restrained, perhaps sensing the shift in my approach. His subtle provocations continued, but I was no longer reacting impulsively. I responded with calm, measured actions, documenting each incident meticulously. The pattern of violence and deceit was no longer invisible. It was carefully mapped, recorded, and prepared for legal exposure. I also explored avenues to protect the stepson emotionally. I carefully monitored his interactions with his father, provided reassurance, and created consistent routines that reinforced safety and normalcy. Balancing the need for evidence collection with the care of the child required constant attention, but it also strengthened my resolve. My actions were not merely about protecting myself. They were about preserving a stable, loving environment for a child who had already faced trauma. During this period, I confirmed additional financial irregularities. Hidden debts, secret transfers, and misleading statements became evident. Each discovery deepened my understanding of the scope of my husband's control and manipulation. The reality became clear. The slap was the beginning of a pattern, and my response would determine whether I remained a victim or reclaimed my life. I finalized my preparations for decisive action. Legal counsel was fully briefed, emergency resources were ready, and the stepson's welfare was fully secured. Every document, every piece of evidence, and every safety measure was in place. I had transformed from a position of fear and victimhood to one of strategy, preparation, and empowerment. The days following the filing of the divorce and restraining order became an intense period of constant vigilance, reflection, and strategic planning. Each morning I awoke with a mix of relief and apprehension. Relief that the first decisive action had been taken to protect both myself and the stepson, and apprehension because my husband's reactions remained unpredictable. I knew that a man who had already resorted to physical violence over money could escalate in ways I had not yet witnessed. Every step had to be calculated, every decision deliberate, and every interaction carefully documented. I began by reviewing every aspect of our household operations. Bills, accounts, utility payments, and even daily schedules were meticulously logged. I traced the flow of money over the previous months, cross-referencing bank statements and receipts to identify any further anomalies. Patterns began to emerge. Funds had been shifted, withheld, and misreported in ways that suggested my husband had been planning financial maneuvers behind my back for months, if not longer. Each discovery reinforced the urgency of my actions and the necessity of keeping the stepson shielded from these truths until the time was right. At the same time, I focused on understanding his psychological patterns. His anger over the $30,000 land sale had not been a simple reaction to financial loss. It had been an assertion of control, a mechanism to reinforce power over me and the household. I observed his behavior, noting triggers, moods, and the subtle ways he attempted to manipulate the environment to unsettle me. Every raised voice, every sudden change in tone, every defensive gesture became data for me to analyze. My approach shifted from reactive fear to strategic observation. I began documenting even minor incidents, knowing that a pattern of coercion and intimidation would be critical evidence for legal proceedings. The stepson's presence added both complexity and purpose to my actions. I had to balance legal strategy, personal safety, and caregiving. He had begun to sense the tension, and I could see moments of confusion and worry in his behavior. I structured daily routines to provide stability, predictable meal times, study schedules, and moments of recreation that allowed him to feel secure despite the turbulence in the household. I became hyper-aware of his emotional state, making notes of changes in mood, sleep patterns, and reactions to his father's presence. Ensuring his psychological safety was as vital as my own physical protection, and every move I made considered his well-being. Meanwhile, the hidden financial motives behind my husband's rage began to reveal themselves in disturbing clarity. I discovered that he had intended to use the $30,000 from the land sale not for the stepson's surgery, but to cover a series of secret debts and financial obligations. There were transactions suggesting payments to creditors I had never been told about, amounts withdrawn without explanation, and transfers to accounts in names I did not recognize. The slap had been his reaction to my disruption of this secret plan. It was not about the stepson at all. It had been about control, secrecy, and punishment for my interference. The betrayal cut deeper than the physical pain. It undermined the very notion of trust in our marriage. With this knowledge, my determination hardened. I knew that exposing this deceit was necessary not only for my own protection, but for the long-term well-being of the stepson. I systematically organized every piece of evidence: financial statements, bank transfer confirmations, copies of the land sale documents, and notes on behavioral patterns. Each item added clarity, demonstrating the intentionality behind my husband's actions. The pattern was unmistakable. He had manipulated and misled, creating circumstances where I was vulnerable, and then reacted violently when I asserted autonomy. In addition to financial scrutiny, I began examining his social connections, emails, phone records, and social media activity indicated relationships and communications that had been concealed. There were signs of undisclosed interactions with parties connected to debts, questionable investments, and potentially exploitative arrangements. These findings contextualized his anger, showing that the slap was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of secrecy and control. Every detail was cataloged, carefully stored, and cross-referenced to ensure accuracy. The environment of the household remained tense and unpredictable. My husband's presence was a constant stressor, requiring careful negotiation of shared spaces and daily interactions. Each encounter demanded calm composure and deliberate responses. I learned to navigate these moments by maintaining a neutral demeanor, minimizing confrontations, and keeping the stepson's exposure to conflict as limited as possible. Even mundane activities like meal preparation, laundry, and household management became exercises in strategy and mindfulness. Parallel to household vigilance, I explored all legal and protective measures available. Consultation with attorneys provided insight into restraining orders, custody arrangements, and financial protections. I reviewed state laws in Georgia regarding domestic violence, spousal support, and step-parent rights, ensuring that every action I took was grounded in legal precedent. This research was essential to transforming fear into actionable steps, giving me the confidence to move decisively and safeguard my future. Amidst this, I created a timeline of events leading up to and following the slap. Each entry included dates, times, descriptions of interactions, and documentation of financial transactions. This timeline became a visual and organizational tool, allowing me to present a coherent narrative if and when legal proceedings required it. It also helped me maintain clarity amidst the chaos, keeping the focus on facts rather than emotional overwhelm. The psychological impact of the betrayal and violence was profound. I experienced moments of fear, anger, and disbelief, but also a growing sense of empowerment. Recognizing the calculated nature of my husband's actions allowed me to depersonalize his aggression, understanding it as a manifestation of control and secrecy rather than a reflection of my worth. This shift in perspective was critical, providing the resilience necessary to continue gathering evidence and planning my next steps. I also reached out to trusted friends and support networks. Confidential discussions with close allies provided perspective, encouragement, and practical advice. These conversations reinforced the understanding that leaving the marriage and protecting the stepson was not only justified, but necessary. Emotional support became a vital component of strategy, helping maintain equilibrium amidst ongoing tension and uncertainty. During one particularly tense day, I discovered additional financial irregularities that illuminated the depth of my husband's deception. Receipts, bank statements, and electronic communications revealed that large sums of money had been funneled into accounts linked to personal indulgences and obligations that I had not been informed about. The stepson's surgery had been a secondary consideration, a justification to mask broader financial manipulations. The slap in this context became a physical assertion of dominance over my interference in these hidden arrangements. This revelation galvanized my next actions. I knew that further delay would increase risk to both myself and the stepson. I reviewed all collected evidence, ensuring completeness and accuracy. Each document, record, and observation was checked against others to confirm consistency. This meticulous review provided confidence that any future legal or protective measures would be based on irrefutable evidence. To safeguard the stepson's interests, I also coordinated with his medical providers, ensuring that he received consistent care and that all medical expenses were accounted for independently of my husband's financial manipulation. This created a buffer between the child's welfare and my husband's ongoing schemes, ensuring that his recovery and safety were not compromised by adult conflicts. Simultaneously, I began planning a safe relocation if necessary. Emergency contacts, temporary housing options, and secure financial access were all arranged in advance. Contingency plans included immediate departure routes, backup communication methods, and accessible storage for important documents. These preparations provided both security and peace of mind, reducing the vulnerability created by remaining in the house with an unpredictable and violent partner. As the days passed, the sense of control and empowerment grew. I had transformed fear into strategy, observation into documentation, and chaos into clarity. The slap, once a moment of shock and terror, had catalyzed a period of intense preparation and strategic action. I now had the tools, evidence, and knowledge to confront the situation decisively, protecting both myself and the stepson from further harm. The stage was set for the next critical steps. The evidence was complete, legal counsel was prepared, and protective measures were in place. Every observation, every record, and every calculated action had led to this point. The forthcoming confrontation and exposure of my husband's hidden motives would be both inevitable and necessary. The careful planning, documentation, and protective measures of the past weeks set the stage for the ultimate confrontation. I had built a fortress of evidence, clarity, and strategy, but the emotional and legal climax was still ahead. Every detail I had collected, the financial records, the irregular transactions, the timeline of deceit, and the behavioral patterns, was now ready to support the decisive action I had been preparing for. The tension in the house reached a quiet, deceptive calm. My husband seemed unaware that the restraining order had been officially filed and that the divorce papers were in his hands. I knew the moment he realized the extent of my actions would be pivotal. It was not just about asserting legal control. It was about exposing the truth of his motives, the manipulation, and the violence. The stepson's safety remained my top priority, and the timing of the exposure had to ensure that he remained secure and unaffected by the confrontation. I began arranging the logistics for the legal meeting and the final handover of evidence. Every detail was considered. Secure transport of documents, witnesses present if needed, and clear communication lines with my attorney. My goal was not to provoke further violence, but to ensure an incontrovertible record of his actions and to establish my position firmly in the legal and protective framework. Mentally, I prepared for the emotional intensity of the moment. Years of betrayal, manipulation, and fear culminated in this confrontation. The slap, the deception, the hidden financial schemes, all of it would be addressed. I rehearsed the sequence of events in my mind, visualizing a composed factual presentation that left no room for misinterpretation or evasion. I reminded myself that my strength came not from anger, but from preparation, evidence, and the unwavering commitment to protect both myself and the stepson. The household atmosphere shifted subtly as the day of confrontation approached. My husband sensed change, though he could not pinpoint it. I maintained calm and neutrality, interacting only when necessary and keeping the stepson shielded from any tension. I noticed small signs: a glance held too long, a slightly raised voice, a sudden pause in conversation. Each sign reinforced the urgency of moving forward quickly and decisively. Finally, the day arrived. I ensured that the stepson was occupied safely elsewhere, that all critical documents were secured, and that my attorney was ready to intervene if necessary. This was the culmination of weeks of strategy, observation, and preparation. The confrontation was not about revenge. It was about exposure, justice, and reclaiming control over a life that had been undermined by violence and deception. As I approached the location for the meeting, a mixture of apprehension and resolve surged through me. Every step was deliberate, every action calculated. I understood that the next moments would define the legal and emotional resolution of the conflict, and that my preparation would be the key to ensuring safety, clarity, and justice. The moment I faced him, the weight of every betrayal, every violent act, and every hidden scheme pressed down on me. I could see the confusion and simmering anger in his eyes, but I was no longer afraid. I had prepared meticulously, gathered evidence, and arranged every detail so that there could be no manipulation, no evasion, no twisting of facts. This confrontation was about exposing the truth and reclaiming control over my life. I presented the documents first, laying out the timeline of the $30,000 land sale, the steps taken to ensure the stepson's surgery, and the evidence of his hidden motives and manipulations. Every page, every note, every financial record told a story of deceit, selfishness, and control. I stayed calm, measured, and unflinching, knowing that my composure was more powerful than any outburst he might attempt. The physical slap, which had once shocked me into disbelief, now served as the pivot point for the legal and emotional exposure. I showed evidence of the assault, bruises, medical records, and time-stamped photographs that documented his violence. The impact of this proof was immediate. He could no longer deny what had happened, could no longer maintain the illusion of control over me or the narrative we had lived under. As the legal papers were formally handed over, divorce filings, restraining orders, and financial disclosures, the reality of his loss became tangible. His face shifted through confusion, anger, and a dawning realization that nothing could reverse the exposure of his actions. This was not a theatrical victory for me. It was the enforcement of boundaries and the defense of my safety and dignity. Throughout the confrontation, I kept the stepson's welfare at the center of my decisions, ensuring that he remained safe, protected, and unaware of the deeper conflicts had required careful planning. By controlling the narrative and handling the disclosure responsibly, I preserved his emotional security while holding the husband accountable for his actions. The legal representatives observed every step, documenting reactions and confirming compliance with the restraining order. Each procedural move reinforced the irrevocability of the confrontation. My husband attempted to justify, argue, and shift blame, but the preparation and evidence rendered all attempts ineffective. There was no escape from the truth, and no path back to the control he had once exercised. After the confrontation concluded, the next hours and days were focused on securing my personal space, confirming the stepson's safety, and implementing the protective measures outlined by the attorney. Every precaution, from changing locks to updating contact protocols, was executed with precision to prevent retaliation or further manipulation. Emotionally, the confrontation was exhausting but clarifying. I felt the release of years of fear, manipulation, and suppressed anger. The slap, once a symbol of betrayal and violation, now marked the turning point where I reclaimed agency over my life. The exposure of his motives, the documentation of his violence, and the execution of legal protections created a foundation for a new chapter of autonomy, safety, and emotional clarity. The husband's reaction was telling. His attempts to regain control or assert authority failed at every turn. With the divorce proceedings in motion and the restraining orders active, his influence over the household, over my decisions, and over the stepson was effectively nullified. The legal framework and my preparation ensured that his next steps would be constrained, accountable, and documented. In the aftermath, I took time to reflect on the sacrifices made and the injustices endured. Selling the $30,000 land, while motivated by care for the stepson, had triggered a violent and unexpected betrayal. The confrontation exposed not only his immediate rage, but also the deeper, hidden motives that had underpinned his actions. This clarity allowed me to move forward with knowledge, protection, and the determination to rebuild a life free from control and fear. Every step following the confrontation was deliberate. Communication with the stepson was managed carefully to preserve trust and security. Family contacts were informed selectively, balancing disclosure with protection. Legal processes continued, ensuring the husband's accountability and preventing interference with personal and familial stability. The transformation from victim to empowered, protected individual was gradual but profound. Each action taken reinforced boundaries, preserved safety, and ensured that the betrayal could not extend further into the lives of those I cared for. The confrontation marked the pivotal moment where fear ended and agency began, establishing the foundation for the next chapter. Now, with the legal measures in place, the stepson safe, and the household secured, the final resolution of this traumatic chapter could unfold. I had proven beyond doubt that the choices made were both necessary and justified. Every act of preparation, documentation, and strategic action had culminated in the protection of myself and the young life dependent on our intervention. The days following the confrontation were both exhausting and oddly liberating. Every precaution I had taken now bore fruit. The restraining order was active, the divorce proceedings were officially filed, and the stepson's safety was secure. I could feel the tension slowly lifting, though the emotional weight of betrayal and violence lingered. The slap, once a sudden shock, had become the marker of everything that needed to change, and it reminded me daily of why leaving was not just necessary, but urgent. The husband, now fully aware of the legal and personal consequences of his actions, could no longer manipulate the household or control the narrative. His attempts to contact me were intercepted or documented, leaving him powerless to interfere. Every call, every message, every uninvited appearance was a reminder that boundaries were now enforced and that I was no longer a passive participant in a life dominated by fear and control. With the stepson still processing the recovery from surgery, I balanced nurturing care with careful explanations appropriate for his age. He needed reassurance that his health and well-being were paramount and that the conflicts between adults were not his responsibility. The careful shielding of his emotions was critical, and I became even more mindful of managing interactions with extended family who might have been influenced by the husband's attempts at revisionist narratives. I also focused on securing my financial and personal stability. The sale of the $30,000 land had been a sacrifice, but now the funds were used responsibly for the stepson's care. Planning for my own future became essential. Opening separate accounts, documenting all transactions, and consulting legal counsel ensured that I had independent resources and protection in place. This not only safeguarded my security, but also symbolized reclaiming independence and control over my own life. Family dynamics were strained. Relatives who had once been neutral or supportive were forced to pick sides, and some chose to distance themselves. While painful, this separation clarified alliances and revealed who could be trusted. The husband's deception and violence had created a ripple effect that exposed hidden loyalties and underlying tensions. It was sobering to realize how deeply fractured the family had become, and yet necessary to establish clear boundaries moving forward. Emotionally, I navigated a complex mix of relief, grief, and cautious optimism. Relief at the immediate safety of myself and the stepson, grief over the betrayal and loss of the marital relationship I had invested in, and optimism for the possibility of building a life free from violence and deceit. Daily routines, once mundane, became exercises in autonomy and self-care. Simple acts like organizing personal spaces, planning meals, and managing the stepson's therapy appointments became symbolic of reclaiming control and stability. The husband's presence faded gradually as the legal proceedings progressed. Attempts to reconcile or manipulate were systematically addressed through attorneys and formal channels, leaving him with diminishing influence. Each formal notice, each documented interaction reinforced that the power dynamics had shifted decisively. I was no longer subject to arbitrary rage or control. Interactions with friends and community members became avenues for rebuilding trust and support. Carefully sharing parts of the story where safe and appropriate allowed me to reestablish a network of allies who understood the context and could provide emotional and practical assistance. This community became essential in reinforcing the steps taken to protect the stepson and myself. The final hearings were intense but necessary. Presenting documented evidence of the assault, the hidden motives surrounding the land, and the husband's attempts to manipulate outcomes left no room for doubt. The court recognized the pattern of behavior and enforced protective measures accordingly. The divorce was finalized, the restraining orders confirmed, and financial settlements clarified. The process, though taxing, established an undeniable foundation of safety, legal accountability, and personal autonomy. In the aftermath, I focused on reconstructing daily life with structure and purpose. The stepson's recovery continued, supported by both medical professionals and a secure, stable home environment. Boundaries were firmly maintained, and the household adapted to a rhythm free from fear and coercion. My own sense of self-worth, once undermined by violence and betrayal, gradually strengthened as I witnessed the effectiveness of careful planning, preparation, and decisive action. Reflection on the experience revealed the complex intersection of sacrifice, love, betrayal, and survival. Selling the $30,000 land had been a deeply personal decision motivated by care and responsibility. The husband's violent reaction underscored the dangers of misplaced trust and the necessity of self-protection. The culmination of legal, emotional, and practical measures highlighted the importance of preparation, clarity, and adherence to personal boundaries when confronting betrayal and violence. As life began to stabilize, I continued to focus on long-term planning, future financial security, emotional health, and careful management of family interactions became guiding priorities. The experience reinforced the value of proactive measures, vigilance, and the courage to act decisively in the face of betrayal. Each step taken since the confrontation contributed to a sense of regained control and safety for both myself and the stepson. Through this process, I learned the difficult lesson that sacrifices, even those made with pure intent, can be met with violence and betrayal. Protecting oneself, enforcing boundaries, and ensuring accountability are not optional. They are necessary for survival and the well-being of those dependent on us. The journey from fear and manipulation to safety and autonomy required patience, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Every decision, From the moment I sold the land to the filing of divorce papers and restraining orders was guided by careful planning and a commitment to safety. The legal system, while procedural, became a critical instrument in reinforcing boundaries and ensuring consequences for violent and manipulative behavior. This combination of emotional resilience and procedural action created the framework for rebuilding life with dignity, independence, and security. The moments leading up to the final confrontation were tense and deliberate. Every detail had been carefully arranged, from the documentation of the assault to the evidence of the husband's hidden financial motives. There was no room for hesitation or doubt. The house, once a shared home filled with the pretense of safety and trust, had become a symbol of control and deceit. Leaving it, even temporarily, had been necessary, but returning to assert legal and personal authority was inevitable. On the day of the final legal proceeding, I approached with a mixture of resolve and apprehension. The air was thick with the weight of past actions, the silent tension of betrayal, and the anticipation of closure. Each step toward the courthouse, each breath taken in preparation, reinforced the commitment to safety and justice. The husband, fully aware of the consequences awaiting him, attempted to project control, but the foundation of authority had shifted. In the courtroom, the presentation of facts was meticulous. Every transaction involving the $30,000 land, the coordination of the stepson's surgery, the documentation of the assault, and the hidden financial motives were laid bare. Legal representation ensured clarity and precision, leaving no opportunity for distortion. Each piece of evidence told a story of sacrifice, betrayal, and the necessity of decisive action. The husband's previous attempts at control and manipulation were now exposed in full view of the law. The reaction was immediate and revealing. Anger, disbelief, and the futility of attempted manipulation were apparent in his demeanor. Every legal measure enforced his loss of control. Protective orders, divorce filings, and financial settlements solidified boundaries that could no longer be contested. The moment crystallized the reality that the marriage, already fractured by violence and deceit, was irreparably severed. Leaving the courtroom, the weight of the ordeal began to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of relief. The stepson's safety, once uncertain, was now secure under structured care and a stable environment. Boundaries that had been violated through violence were firmly reestablished through legal and procedural measures. The path forward, while emotionally taxing, was now navigable with clarity and authority. The husband's attempts to undermine the process outside the courtroom were systematically neutralized. Calls, messages, and uninvited appearances were documented and addressed through legal channels. Each intervention reinforced the authority of the protective measures and the commitment to safety. Control, once unilaterally exercised through intimidation and violence, had been decisively returned to the rightful parties. The aftermath required careful reconstruction of daily life. Tasks once shared now required independent management. Financial planning, household maintenance, and the stepson's ongoing recovery became structured routines, each reinforcing autonomy and stability. The emotional burden of betrayal was tempered by visible steps toward security, independence, and accountability. Relationships with extended family were reevaluated. Alliances shifted as the reality of the husband's actions became clear. Some relatives distanced themselves, while others provided support and validation. The fracture caused by violence and betrayal revealed underlying dynamics previously unnoticed, highlighting the importance of trust, integrity, and protective boundaries in all interactions. Emotionally, recovery was gradual. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but processing the trauma of violence and betrayal required sustained attention. Counseling, support networks, and structured routines contributed to rebuilding a sense of personal safety and self-worth. The experience reinforced the need for vigilance and proactive measures in all aspects of life where trust had been violated. Financially, the consequences of the land sale were managed with careful planning. While the $30,000 had been allocated to the stepson's surgery, long-term financial stability required reassessment and restructuring. Independent accounts, budgeting, and legal oversight ensured that resources were protected and utilized effectively for ongoing needs. This practical restructuring was both a necessity and a symbol of regained autonomy. The stepson's relationship with both adults was carefully managed. Emphasis on safety, emotional support, and clear explanations appropriate to his age created a foundation of trust and security. Protecting him from the emotional fallout of the husband's betrayal required intentional actions and consistency in routines and messaging. The focus was always on his well-being and the maintenance of a safe environment. Every step taken since the initial act of violence was informed by the lessons learned through sacrifice and betrayal. Legal systems, protective measures, and personal vigilance combined to create a structure that ensured safety, accountability, and empowerment. The clarity of these steps reinforced the understanding that self-preservation and protection of dependents were paramount. Reflection on the overall experience highlighted the complex interplay of sacrifice, loyalty, betrayal, and survival. Selling the $30,000 land had been a deeply considered act of care, yet it revealed the fragility of trust when met with violence. The subsequent legal and procedural steps demonstrated the necessity of decisive action in the face of betrayal, emphasizing the importance of establishing boundaries, documenting evidence, and seeking accountability. Recovery and rebuilding were ongoing. Daily routines, emotional processing, financial restructuring, and relationship management formed the foundation for a renewed life. The experience reinforced resilience, self-reliance, and the critical importance of safeguarding both personal and dependent welfare. Each day reinforced the lessons learned through the trauma of betrayal and the courage required to act decisively. The days that followed the courtroom confrontation were filled with a strange mixture of relief and lingering tension. The immediate danger had passed, but the emotional weight of what had happened hung over me like a shadow. Each morning began with careful attention to routines that reinforced my safety and independence. Every task, from managing finances to ensuring the stepson's well-being, carried the echo of the betrayal I had endured. I took time to carefully review the legal protections now in place. Protective orders, custody arrangements, and financial settlements were more than paperwork. They were a lifeline that ensured the husband could no longer exert control or threaten my security. Each clause, each legal requirement, was a reinforcement of the boundary that had been crossed with violence, and the recognition of that reinforced my determination to never return to the situation. Daily life required vigilance. Communications from the husband were filtered and documented, ensuring that any attempts at intimidation would be met with immediate legal response. Home routines were adjusted to minimize risk, with careful attention to who had access to the residence and when. Every step, while seemingly mundane, was a deliberate act of self-preservation, a reinforcement of the lessons learned from the moment of betrayal. Interactions with the stepson became central to my daily priorities. His recovery from surgery required consistent monitoring, emotional support, and reassurance. The experience had been traumatic for him as well, though he could not fully understand the complexities of adult betrayal. My presence, guidance, and careful management of his environment created a sense of stability and safety, ensuring that the trauma he experienced did not define his sense of security in the future. Financial recovery and planning became an ongoing focus. The $30,000 land sale had been a significant sacrifice, and while it had been necessary to fund the stepson's surgery, it also required careful management to rebuild long-term security. Independent accounts, strict budgeting, and oversight of every transaction ensured that resources were protected from potential misuse. Each financial decision carried the dual purpose of stability and protection against future betrayal. Family dynamics remained complicated. Extended relatives were aware of the incident, and their reactions varied. Some expressed support and concern, validating the actions taken to protect both myself and the stepson. Others were distant or judgmental, unwilling to fully acknowledge the husband's violence. Navigating these relationships required discernment, patience, and the ability to maintain boundaries without compromising personal integrity. The husband's attempts to influence the stepson were carefully monitored. Any interaction that could potentially manipulate or threaten his sense of security was limited and documented. Counseling support for the stepson helped him process his experience and understand that the actions of adults did not reflect his own worth or responsibility. These steps reinforced a stable environment, ensuring that the betrayal and violence would not extend into his emotional development. Personal recovery included emotional and mental health support. Therapy provided a space to process trauma, reflect on choices, and build resilience. Daily reflection, journaling, and mindfulness practices complemented formal counseling, allowing a structured approach to rebuilding confidence and reinforcing boundaries. Each step was deliberate, aimed at reclaiming autonomy and self-respect. Interactions with friends and community also became essential. Social support networks offered validation, understanding, and practical assistance. Sharing experiences with trusted individuals reinforced the importance of accountability and provided perspective on the journey from betrayal to empowerment. These connections created a buffer against isolation and reinforced the necessity of proactive measures in recovery. The physical space of the home was restructured to reflect the new reality. Personal belongings, security measures, and living arrangements were adjusted to create a safe, autonomous environment. Each adjustment, while practical, carried symbolic significance, reclaiming control over the space and redefining it as a sanctuary rather than a site of past violence. Legal follow-up continued to be an integral part of life, monitoring compliance with protective orders, ensuring the husband adhered to custody arrangements, and documenting any violations reinforced the authority of the law and minimized risk. These actions, while procedural, were critical in maintaining the hard-won boundaries that had been established. The stepson's long-term well-being remained a central concern. Medical follow-ups, emotional support, and the gradual restoration of normal routines contributed to a sense of safety and normalcy. Observing his recovery and adaptation was a daily reminder of the significance of the sacrifice made, as well as the necessity of protective action when betrayal and violence occurred. Personal growth emerged from the experience. The trauma revealed vulnerabilities, but also highlighted resilience, resourcefulness, and the capacity for decisive action. Each choice, from selling the land to pursuing legal action, reinforced a framework of self-preservation and accountability. The lessons learned informed future decisions, relationships, and approaches to conflict, emphasizing the importance of vigilance, integrity, and proactive management of risk. Reflecting on the relationship with the husband, it became clear that the betrayal was not an isolated act, but a culmination of patterns of control and entitlement. Recognizing this allowed for a clean emotional break, minimizing the risk of lingering attachment or false hope. Understanding the motivations behind the violence reinforced the necessity of permanent separation and the establishment of independent authority over personal and familial matters. Rebuilding trust in relationships took intentional effort. Friendships, community ties, and interactions with the stepson were nurtured with transparency, consistency, and clear boundaries. The experience informed approaches to conflict, decision-making, and emotional safety, emphasizing the importance of protective measures and clarity of intention in all future interactions. The impact on personal identity was profound. The experience redefined notions of self-worth, resilience, and agency. Actions previously motivated by loyalty and care were reframed through the lens of self-preservation and moral clarity. Each decision, documented and reflected upon, reinforced the understanding that sacrifice does not justify violence and that boundaries must be respected regardless of relational ties. The journey from the moment of the slap to the establishment of legal and personal boundaries demonstrated the necessity of decisive action. Each step, from documenting evidence to managing the stepson's recovery, created a structured path toward autonomy, security, and empowerment. The trajectory of recovery highlighted the interplay of legal authority, emotional processing, and practical measures in ensuring long-term safety and stability. Weeks after leaving the house were marked by careful planning and structured routines. Each day began with checking that the stepson's needs were met, ensuring his medical appointments were on schedule, and confirming that the funds from the land sale were being properly allocated for ongoing care. The relief from his successful surgery was tempered by the ever-present awareness that the husband's violence had created a permanent fracture in the family structure. Every action had to be deliberate, every decision weighed for its immediate and long-term consequences. Securing a safe residence became a priority. The house I had once shared with the husband was no longer a sanctuary, but a place of threat. I relocated to a smaller property within the same city in Georgia, close enough to maintain access to necessary resources, but removed from the proximity that allowed intimidation or surveillance. Each room was organized not only for comfort, but for security, with locks, alarms, and contingency plans for emergencies. The structure of the environment reinforced the emotional and legal boundaries I had set. Financial oversight became a critical focus. The $30,000 land had been a significant asset, and while it had served its purpose in funding the surgery, it required careful management to ensure that it could not be misappropriated by the husband or anyone acting on his behalf. Separate bank accounts, secure documentation, and the consultation of a financial advisor reinforced the security of the remaining assets and provided a framework for future planning. Each transaction, even routine payments, was reviewed and documented, ensuring accountability and transparency. The stepson's emotional recovery required attention equal to his physical healing. Counseling sessions, school support, and consistent routines were established to provide stability and reassurance. It was essential to communicate in ways appropriate for his age, that the acts of adults did not reflect his own behavior or value. Each day included careful monitoring of interactions with proactive guidance to prevent exposure to further conflict or negative influence from the husband or extended family members who remained loyal to him. Communication with external authorities and support systems was maintained. Police contacts, domestic violence advocates, and legal advisors were regularly consulted to ensure continued compliance with restraining orders and protective measures. Any attempt at contact by the husband was recorded, reported, and legally addressed, reinforcing both the rule of law and personal boundaries. Each step served to prevent regression into unsafe conditions and reaffirm the independence established through decisive action. The legal separation process progressed steadily. Divorce proceedings, custody arrangements, and financial settlements were pursued with precision and attention to detail. Evidence of the assault and the husband's motives, gathered in the immediate aftermath of the slap, provided clarity and reinforced the necessity of a formal separation. The documentation served not only to secure legal protection, but also to validate the emotional and physical experiences that had necessitated the break. Rebuilding personal identity and confidence became an ongoing endeavor. Therapy sessions focused on the effects of trauma, resilience strategies, and the reconstruction of self-worth. Each day included activities to reinforce autonomy, including decision-making, financial management, and personal reflection. The act of reclaiming control over daily life contributed to a growing sense of empowerment and the ability to navigate future challenges without fear. Interactions with extended family were approached cautiously. Supportive relatives provided guidance, encouragement, and practical assistance, while others who aligned with the husband's perspective were approached with strict boundaries. The necessity of discernment and selective engagement ensured that relationships remained healthy and did not compromise safety or emotional well-being. Work and professional responsibilities were managed with renewed focus. Employment provided not only financial independence, but also a structured environment in which autonomy and decision-making could be exercised safely. Colleagues and supervisors were informed as necessary of the situation to maintain professional boundaries and ensure a stable work environment. The consistency of routine and accountability in professional life reinforced personal agency and recovery. Health and physical well-being were actively maintained. The stress and trauma of the assault required attention to sleep, nutrition, and physical activity. Each step reinforced resilience and reduced vulnerability to the physical manifestations of emotional stress. Mindfulness, meditation, and structured exercise were integrated into daily life to support recovery and maintain clarity in decision-making. The relationship with the stepson evolved into one of mutual trust and stability. By consistently providing care, guidance, and emotional support, a secure bond was established. While the husband's betrayal had created fear and confusion, the consistent presence of a safe, nurturing environment allowed the stepson to process the experience and develop a resilience. Observing his growth and adaptation reinforced the justification for the sacrifice of the land and the protective measures taken. Please tell me in the comments section if I was right or wrong to sell the land for his son, expose his violence and betrayal, and leave the house without looking back, because this decision didn't just end her honeymoon early. It cost her the husband she loved, turned our parents against me, and left our family so fractured that my own children haven't spoken to their cousins in 2 years. And I'm sure she won't be inviting me to her next family event this year.